Hello everyone, I am Meepy, and this is going to be a very brief PowerPoint on a possible armor roster for the Space Marines, specifically an Ultramarine faction, which will absolutely be one of the headlining races if Total War Warhammer 40,000, say that 5 times fast, turns out to be the next game. If not, we could still have a little fun. I will be briefly discussing other races as well, but this purely tries to get a core roster that fits the Ultramarines and can be a really good core base that can flesh out the entirety of the Imperium. Other chapters are just Space Marines with a few extra units, so Ultramarines make a good fit for having the base of everyone going forward. I fully understand they're not the most exciting. Personally, I wish they could be rather the Salamanders or the Blood Angels. I think they're more aesthetically pleasing, but as stated before, they're just such a good everything faction that I think they have to be the first one. Starting with the actual starting factions, I believe these are going to be what the new game headlines with. We have our Loyalist Marines, our Chaos Marines, and then finally the other hooligans that populate the entire known galaxy. Now, as for the Loyalist Marines, of course, we have the Ultramarines, which we're talking about today, but I also think the Iron Hands would be a fantastic secondary chapter to sort of get some yin and yang in there. The Iron Hands, for anyone who doesn't slobber all over the lore, are still Loyalist, but they're a lot more to themselves, and they don't really like the Empire as much as the Ultramarines do. So while Guilliman is going to be reclaiming the galaxy in the name of the Emperor, the Iron Hands can kind of do their own thing while also repelling chaos. Which, speaking of chaos, you have our two Chaos Marines. It can still be one with just being the Black Legion. Anything underlined in red are absolute certainties. I think they're absolutely going to be in the game. Anything not underlined red can be switched around. The Black Legion are the Ultramarines of the Chaos Forces. They're kind of an everything. They are Chaos Undivided. I think the secondary chapter would be the Emperor's Children. I think they go against the Iron Hand very well. I also think they're just very cool to look at. Who doesn't like Noise Marines? It might be weird to have one Monogod faction and not have the Death Guard, the Thousand Suns. I just think those other in Chaos chapters have much better rivalries going forward. So let's say with the Thousand Suns, you can have a Space Wolves versus the Thousand Suns chapter, bringing in those guys, which I think would be very fun. As for the other hooligans, I think the Orks are a tremendous analog from Fantasy to 40k. They're universal. Everyone knows what an Ork is. They're also extremely simple. They can be a horde faction, pillaging the entire galaxy, which is a great juxtaposition from the Ultramarines and even the Chaos Marines trying to make their own empires. And any person coming from Fantasy will be able to look at an Ork and go, those are the guys I want to play. They're also so aesthetically different from all the different Marines. You might also notice there's no Imperial Guard on here. I will talk about them later. But another surefire faction is the Eldari. Whenever I ask my friends about this topic, they always mention it. I've seen it talked up on YouTube. I would rather it not be, but they make sense. They're going to be very unique. The craft world Eldari can be sort of similar to the Pirate Coast from Total War Warhammer 3. Sorry, 2. All the games meld together in my mind. I think the Tau are also a very good option, and the biggest problem I have with the Eldari are that the Drukhari definitely aren't going to headline with them unless it was a separate title. I think they're still a good neutral faction in the grand scheme of things. They can off do their own things. They're still more about empire building than the Orks, so all in all, they would still be interesting. I think they're also very cool. They'd be the magic faction in comparison to all these people. Am I sad to not see the Tau or the other things? Yes, but I think these are a very strong core roster for the entirety of the galaxy. Now moving on to the actual legendary lords, I'm going to get the simple ones out of the way. You have Chapter Master Calgar. He's your heavy fire support. He has your buffs for your tactical marines, your dreadnoughts, blade guard, all the simple frontline troops. He's very aggressive. I think he represents the Ultramarines very well. And because Creative Assembly likes to do one melee lord and one caster lord, not that there's really much melee only in 40k, but you get what I mean. You have the Chief Librarian Tigurius. He is the librarian of the Ultramarines. He is your magic guy if you want to specialize in magic or psychic phase, whatever this game is going to have. Let's get the more controversial thing out of the way. I think Primarch Guilliman should be the legendary lord of the faction. I've seen people say the Primarchs are too strong to be playable lords. I think that's ridiculous. I think cutting out characters in the future like Mortarion or Angron is very silly. Now, of course, he'd be extremely beefy. He's the unifier of the entire empire. He can be able to probably solo planets if you specialize him enough. He's a melee powerhouse. And that gauntlet right there, if you look at that image, he can blast the tank in half. I think there's only going to be 2 legendary lords at the beginning. I think Chapter Master Calgar, if it's not Gilliman, it has to be him. And that Calgar might come in a DLC later down the line. I think Tigurius is assured. I think they would love to have that caster hero. But Gilliman is, I wish to see him in front. I think Primarch should be at the front of this game. They should be the legendary faction leaders. That's like cutting out Nagash from Warhammer 3. And now he's coming, so. Moving on to your generic lord, I really only see 2 options here. Possible further options DLC can happen. But you have your captains, they're hybrid lords, pretty strong in melee. And your librarians, who are your spellcasters, buffed under Tigurius, your anti-armor sort of elite. I think both lords, for people who don't play tabletop, brief tangent, you can put different armors and weapons on people. I think that customizable armors in the campaign should be unlocked via level. So your Phobos armors, your Graviton armor, your Terminator armor should be unlockable, and you can put them on and it'll change up your little. I think both should also be able to undergo Primaris upgrades. At the end of the day, it's only a stat increase. It also includes those models without you having to add them in later in DLC. This is Creative Assembler talking about. Everything's going to be DLC, but I can hope. You know, everyone can hope. Everyone's a little hopeful nowadays. I think maybe possible lords can go down the line, but these are your generic whatever. I think captains could also be their own thing if they want to DLC someone like Tigurius for some reason. Your librarians can be a lockable lord, but that's lame, and fuck that. Here are your heroes. Now you have your lieutenants, standard melee support. Apothecaries can be your healers. Tech Marines are your vehicle repairs. I think Cato Sicarius works great for a legendary hero. I think every faction should get a legendary hero. He's also just extremely iconic. You might be noticing there's one very obvious hero choice I'm neglecting here. That's going to be in our DLC section. To those who don't play the Ultramarines, you can just stay in not knowing. And now moving on to our very standard ground troops. This is where we actually get to have fun, because that's what this game should be about. Now, you have your Tactical Marines. These are a given. If these guys weren't in the game, I'd be shocked. They are your range trooper. They are your standard line infantry. They're decent melee combatants. If someone pulls up on them, their chainswords or combi knives or whatever you want to have with them are very easy to come through them. Tactical Marines come in multiple different variants: rockets, plasma, heavy guns. Whatever you need for the job, your Tactical Marines can fill any position. Now, a bit lower than that, I think the Marine Neophytes would be an interesting beginning option for like tier 1 settlements. They are your rookie Marines. They're still a strong range trooper, but they do have very low morale or armor in comparison to the other Space Marines. I think Neophyte snipers could be a very good option for them to give them a niche instead of just like a meat shield, which is not to say they're a pushover. They're just not a Marine. Moving on to your Hellblaster squad, I think it'd be interesting to have a very specific anti-elite, anti-armor units. They could possibly have an overcharge mechanic, giving more damage as in terms of self-damage. Probably lower in number than your Tactical Marine squad, which might have 18, 24. These guys would more be like 6, 8, 10, whatever. Moving on to your Assault Marines, these are your standard hybrid troop. As stated way earlier, in Warhammer 40,000, there's very rarely a dedicated melee, and especially for Ultramarines, almost everything is hybrid. These are your melee specialists in terms of running around the battlefield. They're very quick. They have jump packs. If we get cliffs or different terrain, they can jump over it and move behind the battle enemy line. I would love to see them in chainsword and pistol variants, but also thunderhammer variants. And finally, you have your Blade Guard. These are your elites. These are to hold the line. You put them at a checkpoint and they will hold. I think they also should have another ability, Sword or Shield of the Imperium, giving them more melee defense or attack respectively. And they'll also have their close range pistols. I don't think they need a Volkite pistol variant, but could be there. Sorry, Hand Flamer. Moving on to your fun vehicles. This is where I like to have more things. You have your Dreadnoughts. I think they should come in Flamer or Plasma variants. Also, just different types of Dreadnoughts. You have your Ballistas for long-ranged elite sniping. I also think it'd be very funny if damaged heroes or even lords, if they took critical injuries, could become Dreadnoughts. I think that'd be very interesting to slap them in armies. Also, I just really like Dreadnoughts. You have your Whirlwinds. These are your long-range artillery. You have your Land Raiders, dedicated transports, and fire supports. They're pretty sizable, chunky bastards. You have your Outriders. They're your pseudo-cavalry. They also have very strong melee. I toyed with the idea of having the attack bikes on there, which is why the image is down below, but I think other chapters could bring that to the table and be a lot more interesting. And then finally, your Terminators. I put these in the vehicle section because they're basically walking tanks. They should basically be counted as a vehicle. Very small. They have a short-range teleportation, so they can zap around the battlefield. I think they'd be very interesting as a unit. I also don't think they should be neglected. Terminators are sort of too iconic, and I think all Lords would have the Terminator armor variants. Other types of Terminators, like the Space Wolves and their more melee-oriented Terminators, I think that's a good DLC option. But base Terminators with their Stormbolters are kind of a must, just for how iconic they are. Now for a more controversial is the wrong word for it. My idea of how to round out the roster, I think Chaff Imperial Guardsmen should be a very strong part of the game. They fill out the entirety of the Imperium. They're very numerous. I don't think they'll be very unique. I think you're going to have your standard guardsmen, maybe some Leman Russes, a Commissar Lord choice, but I don't think we're getting an entire Imperial Guardsman chapter day one. Now, they fill out a generic roster across all the galaxy. They can represent cultists, a bygone militia just holding the line, or, of course, filling out an army roster of Space Marines. Due to the fact that Space Marines are going to be a lot more expensive than Guardsmen, most likely, this helps fill the roster, and it feels wrong to have any Loyalist or even Chaos faction. These could be your Chaos Cultists, your Chaos Guardsmen, without any human support that isn't just a Marine or a troop. These help flesh out armies, flesh out the galaxy, and will be very interesting. For an entire Imperial Guardsman chapter, you'd get your Bulgrins, you'd get more intense vehicles, you'd get your Bane Blades, of course, but I think the Imperium and Chaos for your Marine factions should get access to something to fill things out. Now with that all dealing with, let's talk about possible DLC options down the lines. I think these three are very strong contenders for early DLC. They fill out the roster for the Ultramarines, adding Chaff, generic Marines. But I think every single chapter will just be a single DLC. Example 1, you have your Black Templars, your Chaplain hero choice, your Sword Brethren. This is basically the Black Templars. They are a Marine faction with a few special people. Now you have your Raven Guard, which would give a lot more generic troops. You have your Incursors, your Infiltrators, your Eliminators, something that brings to the table a lot more of a stealthy ambush playstyle. But looking at something like the Blood Angels, which Dante, the Sanguinary Guard, the Death Company, your Sanguinary Priests, this is the Death Guard. Now, that's also a pro and a con. If you get a Blood Angel DLC and we don't get Sanguinary Dreadnoughts, that's going to be crushing because that means they're going to come like years down the line, and I don't want these things to be forgotten. But every Space Marine faction is basically just a DLC. Even looking at something like the Space Wolves, they use normal tactical Marines. They use Dreadnoughts. They use everything in between with a few special units. You have your actual Wolves. You have your people, I'm forgetting the name of those, like Berserker guys. You know what I'm talking about. But every single Space Marine, even Chaos Marines, like the Death Guard, is just a Chaos faction with extra stuff. Now, if we don't get Typhus, and we just get Mortarion and others, we're going to have the same problem, but I believe that's how they're going to run things. Now, other races don't exactly have that issue. Those will be standard DLC packs. I hope you don't just get every single DLC pack being a Marine, but we'll see. This has been my PowerPoint. Thank you so much for listening to me yap. If I was wrong about anything, either in the future or you think this is stupid, please leave a comment, leave a like, and remember, if you're happy, don't be, because Erebus is still alive, and he's coming.